Welcome back, WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and WNST.net. For anyone wiping the sleep out of their eyes on Tuesday morning, my wife came into the studio and said, C.J. Mosley's gone. Are they going to keep anybody, Luke Jones? What's going on, man? We talked so much about this possibility, right? Like that this was real, that someone would covet him. You said it would only take one team. It might have been 2 or 3 teams for all we know. But it looks as though C.J. Mosley is going to be joining the New York Jets. And, boy, the Jets had a lot of money to spend, right?
I was just going to say, it took a lot of money because we know this because we've talked to C.J. plenty of times over the years. We've had him out at live radio shows in the area. This was a guy who very much wanted to be a Baltimore Raven, to the point that I think he would have taken a little bit less. But when you're talking about a 5-year, $85 million contract with a reported $51 million guaranteed that the Jets are giving him, even if the Ravens upped their offer, and from what I understand they did, I still don't know if they got close to that. And it's certainly astronomical money. It's certainly record-setting money at the inside linebacker position. Frankly, the kind of money that I wouldn't have been comfortable going that high on C.J. Mosley.
Well, we talk so much about Brandon Williams. We talk about keeping your own guys. We talk about mistakes you can make in your own house. And obviously Ray Lewis and Ed Reed. And, the Ravens, Ozzie didn't make any of those mistakes, those kinds of mistakes. Some would say, well, the biggest mistake was giving Flack. I hear that with the goose down the dial, but that's the going rate. That's what it cost. And this is what it cost to keep a top 3 linebacker. And the rates keep slipping up as the salary cap moves up and the opportunity to lose players. And I saw Ross Tucker was like the first guy on Twitter screaming like no one loses more players than the Ravens in free agency. And oh, by the way, I've been screaming that the last couple of years with the Yosemite's and the Walkers and all these guys that go out the side door that at some point, you start to bleed a little bit. And they easily could have lost Brandon Williams, right? They could have just let him go a couple of years ago. I don't know what that would have meant money-wise as to something else they would have done, but this isn't about money with C.J. Mosley. Do we have the money? That was the question when Adalys Thomas left and Bart Scott. They literally did not have the money. They have the money now. They're just saying, we're not giving C.J. Mosley $85 million over the next 5 years. Right,
and I'm not faulting that decision. But that doesn't make this a very difficult loss. And you can talk all you want about, you mentioned Osemele, you mentioned Rick Wagner, you can go back to Bart Scott.
I said Walker, not Wagner, my bad.
Oh, yeah, I knew who you meant. But
I was rolling. It was Germans bomb Pearl Harbor.
This is uncharted territory, though, Nestor. They have never lost a multi-time Pro Bowl selection in his mid-20s. C.J. Mosley's not quite 27
Second
years
contract,
old.
Or first big contract. They've never lost this kind of guy. That's correct.
Right. So, and again, I'm not faulting the Ravens for this, although you could certainly say now in hindsight, the franchise tag looked like a far more reasonable endeavor. If you were really hell-bent on keeping him around, at the same time, if it's a question of if you were ever going to go to $17 million per year, then I can certainly understand saying no to that. That's too rich for where I would have gone. But I think the writing was on the wall for this possibly happening on Monday when we saw Quan Alexander get a 4-year, $54 million deal from the San Francisco 49ers. Quan Alexander, who off injured, someone who is not universally regarded as a particularly good player, or let's say a really good player.
He's not a Pro Bowler, let's just call it that.
Sure, and he's getting $13 million per year, $13.5 million per year. That's where you knew that this C.J. Mosley thing was going to go to territory that the Ravens were unlikely to be able to reach. So the question now becomes, where does this football team go at this point? We heard so much at the beginning of the offseason about rebuilding the offense, and they let Michael Crabtree go, Joe Flacco's gone, Alex Collins is gone now by his own doing, John Brown's a free agent. We've talked so much about needing to beef up the interior of the offensive line, but you now look at this defense, and we had already talked about things you'd like to add to the defense, certainly another edge rusher, but now with Eric Weddle gone, you look at safety. Terrell Suggs, we haven't even talked about him to this point.
Right. We just lost our Hall of Fame. Right. Yeah. That's pretty bad. We're 5 minutes into the conversation, but the first thing my wife said on that was, well, he's kind of old, right?
Sure. And look, I mean, Weddle and Suggs, they're both much closer to the end of their career than the beginning. We know that. And
I don't think anyone looks at those guys and says tough loss. I think you look at C.J. Mosley and say, you better sharpen your pens for that draft pick next month, fellas, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would still classify those guys as tough losses just because who are you getting to replace them? Now, I'm confident they'll get someone to replace those guys, but right now in-house, you're talking about Chuck Clark or Deshaun Elliott as a safety to replace Eric Weddle. And again, they might go sign a safety today or tomorrow.
By the way, they have more money than they've ever had, right? Like literally this moment to go spend money, they can buy whatever player they want.
Sure.
Now, at what
maybe
price?
Odell, whoever, right.
They have not had this sort of leeway ever, as I remember. I mean, they've never had a good cap situation because they've always had 3 Hall of Famers on their roster, right? And 2 others that were in the Hall of Haloti Ngata or the Hall of Todd Heap or the Hall of Joe Flacco, right?
Right. I mean, this is really. I'm going to use the R word here that the Ravens might be rebuilding at this point. Now, does that mean a rebuild like what the Orioles are doing right now? No, of course not. But when you look at the number of holes that they already were hoping to address, positions they were hoping to address, and now you definitively add safety, outside linebacker, and inside linebacker to it, I mean, let's look at the candidates. I mentioned safety, Chuck Clark, Deshaun Elliott. I know they like those guys. Can you just sign off on either one of those guys stepping in for Eric Weddle and the Ravens not having a substantial drop-off? No, I'm not going to sign off on that. Those guys would need to prove it, and I'm guessing the Ravens will go out and address that position via the draft or free agency or trade or what have you. Outside linebacker was already a thin position when we thought the Ravens were going to lose Zadarius Smith. Now Terrell Suggs goes off to Arizona to finish his career with the Cardinals, and you're looking at Tyus Bowser and Tim Williams, who, let's call a spade, colossal disappointments to this point in their career. And to me, there should have been some opportunities for either one of them to play last year, and they didn't take advantage of it. And now at inside linebacker, look, I like Patrick Owasso a lot. The Ravens gave him a second-round tender to keep him in town this year. Thank goodness they did at this point because you're going to need him. I like what I saw from Kenny Young in small doses last year, but am I going to sit here and try to buffalo you and say that the Ravens are going to be fine with Patrick Owasso and Kenny Young at inside linebacker? I'm not buying that just yet. So that's not to say that they're doomed, but there is a heck of a lot of work to do on this football team. And unlike many years where we've seen the Ravens lose a player or two here or there, someone that you say, tough to lose that guy regardless of the not being comfortable with the price. To your point, in the past you always said, well, they still have Haloti Ngata, they still have Terrell Suggs. I mean, that was the post-Super Bowl 47.
We could say now they still have Brandon Williams, right? They still have Lamar Jackson, right?
They still have Brandon Williams. They have Michael Pierce, and it's going to be interesting to see if they try to extend him and then what that means for Brandon Williams.
Marlon Humphrey, we got to give him some money.
Marlon Humphrey's their best defensive player at this point, in my mind. And I thought that last year, voting him for team MVP. But now you don't have that experience. You don't have those intangibles that Weddle, Suggs, and even Mosley. But in the case of Mosley, you're talking about a young defensive player in his prime. And look, we can debate all day long what C.J. Mosley is actually worth, and certainly understand the Ravens not going to that extreme degree, $17 million per year to keep him, but it still hurts to lose him. So, and I mean, you can talk about the franchise tag, you could talk about the fact that, and I know for a fact, talking to Mosley at a couple different points over the last calendar year or so, talks really they were not really a priority at any point last year. Now,
they never gave him the Ray Lewis treatment. Let's step up and you know what I'm saying? They never gave him the we can't live without you. And on Tuesday morning, moving forward, they're going to have to figure out how to live without him because they never thought of him as elite. They thought of him as the next rung down from elite. And the money they offered him would speak to that. They thought he was a top 5 linebacker, not the number 1 linebacker.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you. At the same time, no one was projecting him to go to get $17 million. So
well, they didn't want to franchise him and just pay him, right?
Well, and that's the thing, right? I mean, they didn't franchise him. There clearly wasn't a whole lot of urgency to get this done last spring, let's say, or last summer, let's say, because I know talks really weren't happening at that point in time.
Well, it's not like they're shocked today, right? Like literally, like they have discussed living without him the last 60 days because they allowed him to get to the market, and they knew. I mean, they knew better than to think, well, no one will give him the money. I mean, I think if you would have asked Eric before he went to bed on Sunday night, will he still be – to your point on Monday, you thought, he's hitting the market. Once he hits the market, I mean, for $15 million, they could have just kept him around, right? It's like, right. So over that they're going to lose him, and they must be okay being ready to play under the rebuild thing, because that's – you're not going to replace him at this point. You're not going out in the market and giving somebody else $85 million, right?
Right. I mean, for one, I don't know who's left out there. I mean, we saw quite a few linebacker types go off the board in the first day of free agency.
As well as the Honey Badger and some of the safeties, too, right?
I mean, certainly you could bring in a veteran type. I mean, I saw the Ravens were linked as one of 4 or 5 teams in on Brandon Marshall, the linebacker for the Broncos. So it's not as though they can't go that route, and I think they probably will have to go that route because Owasso and Kenny Young are really young. I mean, even Owasso, we're talking about a guy who was considered incredibly raw until he came on very late last year and played well down the stretch. So that doesn't mean they won't draft a linebacker. Doesn't mean that they won't ultimately start young guys, but I think you'll have to add a veteran to that mix at some point, even if it's just someone who has starter experience and is going to be in a part-time capacity. So, this is, if it's not a full-blown rebuild, at least in the context of what that means in the NFL, and I don't mean a Cleveland Browns rebuild, but a team in transition rebuild, reload, however you want to, whatever semantics you want to throw on it. This sure feels like it. So doesn't mean the Ravens are doomed, but it is tough looking at where they are right now, even with the money that they have, and not seeing this team go into the spring and the summer with some significant question marks. And I haven't even mentioned, your 22-year-old franchise quarterback of the future, whatever you want to call Lamar Jackson. He's their guy. Joe Flacco's off to the Denver Broncos. And regardless of who's that quarterback, when you see the defense, which was so important to their run.
And so veteran and so smart and so built into Wink and so built into the system and so wired on alignment and assignment and technique and who needs to be where. And you had 2 coaches out on the field in many cases, with Suggs bringing Ray Lewis institutional knowledge, and Eric Weddle, who might be a head coach in this league at some point if he wants to, if that's the way he wants to go with his life. He'll be a defensive coordinator 8 years from now somewhere, I think, right?
Yeah, Eric DeCosta's even mentioned the possibility of Eric Weddle working for the Ravens at some point in time in the future. There was not animosity in that release. Beyond the disappointment of, hey, you get released and not taking a pay cut.
Well, at this point, I think a lot of these guys would say, Suggs would say, we're not trying to win this year. I want to go to Arizona and, fulfill my dream to put that jersey on and play in the blimp out there I drive by with my buddies. You know what I mean? Like, that was always sort of in the back of Suggs' mind. In Weddle's mind, it's, I want to go win a Super Bowl. You know what I mean? Like, wherever gives me the best chance to win a Super Bowl. Eric, if you don't want to pay me, we'll make nice and whatever, but I want to go win a Super Bowl. I don't, do they really believe Lamar Jackson's going to win I don't know. This year? Nah, I don't know.
This year, I think that would, and look.
If I'm 34 years old, 35, 36 years old, this probably, I'm a fan for life, so I'm in it for the long haul. I can put a 6 and 10 together next year and fake it, Weddle will not have that. He won't feel that way about it. That's for sure.